So there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And I guess what we really want to talk about today is how do we make tariffs part of our strategy and turn it into a competitive advantage as opposed to being sort of at the whims, if you will, of the political landscape and the global economy. So let's go ahead and we'll jump right into this and start having a conversation. So first off, joining me today, Waldo Saville. Waldo's vice president at Efficio, 15 years of experience. I'm Paul Baris. I've been doing supply chain now for over 30 years. And but anyway, so we've got a long, varied background between the two of us in manufacturing and supply chain and procurement. So we're going to be your host today, and we look forward to having this conversation. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the implications. All right, we'll just go ahead and jump through that. But one of the things is tariffs are important, right? And we're going to talk about tariffs primarily in this conversation. But I want to just make it clear that tariffs are only part of the equation, right? I think everyone has certainly seen, whether it be COVID, whether it be the Suez Canal issues, Panama Canal issues, or whatever. I think the key thing here is that there is a tremendous amount of disruption that is always at risk within the supply chain, right? So we've got broader supply chain risks that we would naturally call, risk and resiliency within the supply chain. Tariffs are making that even more volatile right now because there's a lot of unintended consequences. But we're going to come back probably in a month or two, and we're going to talk more about broader risks. But I do at least want to talk a little bit about them here, right? In terms of we obviously have all lived through the COVID situations. We've lived through the Panama and Suez Canal challenges. We've lived through shipping disruptions, right? We've had the Cloudflare technology failures and disruptions. So there's been a lot of challenges globally, probably the most active decade in my career. And so the challenge really becomes, how do we deal with that from a broader supply chain perspectives, right? Whether it be logistics optimization, regulatory compliance, market intelligence, making sure that we've got, a good, robust supplier strategy so we can deal with the exceptions. But the key thing here that we want to talk about today are tariffs, because tariffs are something that are not necessarily uniquely applied, right? When we have challenges with the transportation industry, everyone gets affected to some degree or another. When we have global labor shortages, everybody has some issues to some degree or another. But in the case of tariffs, how your actual supply base is configured really has a big impact on that. And that's what Waldo and I are going to talk about today, is how tariffs can come into play. So the big question that we really need to ask is, do you really understand how tariffs are affecting your competitive position, right? So tariffs directly impact costs, they impact supply chain capacity, and obviously competitiveness. And the challenge is that a lot of companies, while you may know that you're importing from China or importing from Mexico, you may not necessarily understand fully what HST codes or HTS codes are being impacted, but also how do you compare to your competitors, right? The key thing there, again, is when tariffs are uneven, where you're at a disadvantage or an advantage versus your competition, that's when we have pricing and market shifts and changes, right? So for example, if we just did a flat 10%, right, across all steel coming in from anywhere in the world, everybody gets impacted the same way, right? However, if we're only going to say it's 10% coming in from Canada or Mexico, but not China, then obviously if you're importing from China, then at that point you've got an advantage. So the challenge here is to really understand how these tariffs are applied unevenly or equally, and how they're applied versus your competition, right? So for example, in the steel example, right, if your competitor is importing from China and does not have that same 10% impact, then they've got a premium in the marketplace now that they can capture from you, or they have a chance at that point to go after market share. So at that point, it turns into some strategic decisions about how do you need to respond to that competitive threat, right? So how we respond to that is we would start to do some analysis on your HS6 codes and the real-time tariff database, the U.S. Customs Trade database, and benchmark your position against your competition to understand that relative impact, right? And then we would understand what are the key cost drivers and what opportunities for mitigation are possible and what's needed, right? So if you think about it, right, we really need to understand what's the impact to your pricing and your cost structure, medium to long term, and then understand that exposure, look at the scenarios for impact, understand your competitive position in that situation, and then make strategic decision with the rest of your organization of how best to respond to that competitive situation. So here's a very simple example, right? So if we were if we're going to ignore the tariff threats, right, in scenario A, company A, right, versus company B, where we're proactively mitigating a tariff response, right? So the challenge is that, especially I think in today's political climate, there's going to be a constant evolution of negotiation and discussion across the major economic powers in the world, where the situation is constantly going to be in flux, right? So, countries do not want to get into a trade war or into a tariff war. So there's going to be ongoing negotiations, delays, increases, decreases, et cetera. And so we need to be able to have a good understanding of what that exposure is before the disruption occurs, so you can be prepared to take action, right? So having that baseline understanding of the situation is really important. Otherwise, at that point, then you're going to be at the, late in the curve, if you will, if you are not prepared to do that. And then a tariff in a particular, let's say it's Sri Lanka, right? A really small country that does a lot of textile work. If you have a tariff situation in Sri Lanka, all of a sudden that comes up, and you aren't prepared for that, then other competition has the ability to go find alternate suppliers elsewhere in the globe to replace a Sri Lankan supplier, as an example. You don't want to be in that situation. So the idea is, company A isn't keeping track of the tariff updates. They relied on a single supplier in a high tariff country, 25% cost increase immediately, which really gave them no choice but to pass that cost on to consumers. And then at that point in time, the cost impact was huge, and it was both from a cost perspective and lost market share perspective. So the concept here is obviously is that it's very difficult, obviously, to pass along 100% of your cost increase all in one fell swoop, especially when you're dealing with major retailers or wholesalers across the globe. So you invariably end up having to take a mixture of margin hit, and market share hit. So that's what ends up happening if you're not paying attention to the tariffs. Now, when we go look at that from a company B perspective, where we are proactively mitigating the tariff exposure, right? We're prepared. We understand where our risks are ahead of time by our major commodities within our business, right? And we understand where our suppliers are, and we understand the fact that we've got a diversified supply base across multiple regions. So we're more balanced from a risk perspective, but also we understand where our competition is. And we also have already worked with our suppliers to understand their ability to shift production into other areas of the world. So, for example, many companies, especially in Southeast Asia, they've developed their own strategies where they have plants based in different countries based upon capacity, currency, et cetera. And so we want to pre-negotiate and pre-plan for those scenarios so that we can understand what our action plan is going to be based upon any given scenario. So call it scenario risk-based planning, if you will. But the idea is we need to maintain competitive pricing and supply chain stability so that we can give our customers the confidence that we can continue to deliver. But most importantly, we can manage the cost, right? So by spending some time up front with the proactive supplier management and understanding our market competitiveness, then we can minimize that future cost impact. And in many cases, we can actually gain market share, right? Because now, if we have a cost advantage, right, we can choose to how we're going to now respond to the marketplace. So we want to be able to turn a sort of a challenging reactive situation into something that's very proactive, where we can then make strategic decisions that make the most sense for the entire business. So how do we do this, right? So how do we turn this analysis into action, right? So the exposures is, and understanding the exposure is the first step, right? But then we need to develop a clear strategy of how to do this, right? So one of the ways that Efficio helps, obviously, is we can help with some of supplier diversification perspective, right? Onshoring and nearshoring is a very popular topic these days. Well, but if Mexico and Canada get that 10 to 15% penalty across everything, now does that make sense, right? But we can also look at it from a contract renegotiation perspective in terms of how suppliers can share in some of this. We can look at how do we reclassify products. So for example, if we change how much value added is put into a product in a given country, right, then we can often change the HTS code that is then imported under, that may then be able to avoid the tariff completely, or it may be at a lower tariff rate. So it starts to get into a strategy of where's the value added, and how do we do that? And then obviously the operational adjustments, right? Whether we talked about nearshoring just a moment ago, but also do we have domestic suppliers, right? So one of the strategies that sometimes we like to pursue is if we have new products, as an example, let's say, that need to have very fast responsiveness to the marketplace and are also very sensitive to pricing, then maybe we at least keep those onshore, right, short term, until we understand how successful the product is, right? We may pay a little bit of a cost penalty, but we can then respond better to the marketplace and to the demand shifts. And maybe we then move high volume, low value added products offshore, or we look for ways to basically reduce that labor content elsewhere. So we identify different strategies for how we can then move our production needs around the globe based upon what we really need to happen from a strategic perspective. So it's taking these potential last minute risks with the tariff impact, and then turning them into something more strategic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Waldo. He's going to walk us through sort of some examples of some work that we've done, and then we'll be back to take your questions.
Thanks, Paul. So when we're looking at your exposure versus your competitors, it's really a big triage data harvesting piece of work that we do. As you can imagine, we're looking at all of the US customs databases. It's millions and millions and millions of lines of data from all the bill of records, from all the sort of bill of ladings, imports through air and ocean, right? So what we first start to do is really understand the flow and trade of your goods and which products you have a heavy dependence for inputs on, right? And then we can start to go down into, specifically what goods are dependent on the countries of concern. Then we start to classify using those HS6 codes, and then we start to benchmark that against your competitors, and then we start to figure out, what could those mitigating activities be that you could do. So just in a little bit more detail now, right? So in this specific case, we looked at about 30 billion data's worth of available import data. We then started to classify the HS6 codes where the company had a very heavy dependence on those countries of concern. We then rolled that up into the HS4 codes, right? So we have slightly less to work with, but we have to understand as well, some of these HS6 codes are misclassified. So if you go back up to the HS4, then you're casting the net wider so you can be more accurate. And that's when we can then start to analyze your competitors, what's their reliance, specifically in those product groups that we really care about. And once we have a really good idea of those products had a very strong dependent in your company and then the competitors, then we can start drilling down country by country, product code by product code. And ultimately, we can start to evaluate, here's a list of suppliers that could actually really help you relieve yourself of a lot of this exposure, right? So it's a sort of a 5-stage process, but I call it, it's a real triage, just given the amount of data that you're working with. Here is the syntax, the nomenclature of how the codes work, right? So it's essentially a 6-digit code. There are some incremental digits for other countries. But again, so the first one would be 8, in this specific case, 84 would be appliances, 18 would be refrigerators. And then I can just tell you, if that said 29, it would be a commercial refrigerator, right? So they go down to quite a lot of detail. So as you can imagine, when you do all that classification of all of those imports, you can start to get a really good idea as to what you're importing and then what your competitors are importing. And this is a specific analysis on a company. So we looked at their import reliance over the last 10 years. So this is a bit of a weighted average, but what we were seeing was that this company had, of their imports, had a 60% reliance on China. So these are 20-foot containers, had a 30% reliance on South Korea, and had 6% reliance on Hong Kong. That was over the last 10 years. Now, when we did the same analysis over the last 3 years, that 60% that you saw went up to 90%. So actually, they went more towards China. They went up to 90% reliance on China, 5% with South Korea, and 2.5% with Taiwan. There was 2.5% somewhere else. And then what's really interesting about this analysis is that you can obviously see we can go year by year, and we can fairly easily, I mean, one can easily sort of really look at 10 years worth of data using the HS4 and HS6 classifications. But then you can really start to drill down. Okay, so there we go. So that 841829, which is a commercial refrigerator, you can start to see what was their reliance, right? So 57% of their imports on refrigerators was coming from China. Okay, ex-China would be from other countries, right? Whether it's Brazil, whether it's Europe, whoever it may be, right? So you can really get a very good idea as to what those product codes are. And then out of that, you can start thinking about what your strategy is. But this all culminates in this, right? So if we go back up to this one, right, which showed that 90% of imports were reliant on China over the last 3 years, that's the company. And then what we were able to do was to find, excuse the formatting, 8 different competitors. And you could see that of their total amount of imports, you could see that the company with 90% was way more reliant in this specific analysis on China than 7 of the 8 competitors. Only one was 100% reliant on their imports. But again, if we look at the overlap of HS6 codes, that's probably not necessarily an immediate competitor, right? So the other analysis we do is we look at the overlap of HS6, right? So if we look at competitor A, competitor B, competitor C, there's a very strong overlap of HS6 codes, right? And if I'm that company and I know that 90% of my imports are China, 90% of my imports are from China versus 53, 33, and 42, I'd be really thinking about what I'm going to be doing to mitigate that. Because, again, like Paul said at the beginning, if everyone's in the same boat, then inflation, it's all going to happen. You're going to have to PPAP and qualify new parts, and it's going to take everyone probably a similar amount of time. But this specific case is a slightly worrying case for that company. And then again, going back to those product codes that you saw, this type of analysis can really help you prioritize what suppliers you want to go and qualify, and put the engineering effort behind making those qualifications.
What's interesting about this slide, Waldo, is the fact that post-COVID, we've actually seen this in a number of different clients and industries, quite honestly, because China lost volume and the economy in China was slow post-COVID, so prices got reduced. So in some cases, opportunistic importers were able to go renegotiate pricing or move more business to China to get margin in the short term. So while that was effective over the last several years, where they probably have had higher margins, right now it puts them at a greater risk in the opposite direction, where their competitors didn't do that, and so now they have a chance of losing that margin or losing that market share again. So it's not static, right? It's constantly dynamic. Your procurement teams are always looking for ways to add value to your organization. And so sometimes, it works for a period of time, but you can't just say that the strategy that I'm going to take today is going to be the same strategy that's going to work, forevermore.
Yeah. And that's why sometimes, if you're kind of short-term focused and it's, I'm going to go and single source from this supplier, and then the geopolitical situation changes, then you're in a bit of a situation, right? So we're seeing a lot more clients go to dual sourcing, to doing nearshoring. They are keeping stuff in Southeast Asia, but they're also looking at nearer to home options too. Shall we open this up for questions, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, looks like we got one, Waldo.
Okay.
All right, how does Efficio's tool and approach differ from other analysis solutions on the market? Well, I think the key thing there, right, is first off, as the sort of one of the largest procurement and supply chain focused organizations out there, right, we really are trying to look at it from an end-to-end holistic perspective. So as we talked a little bit before, it's not that one-dimensional where it's strictly tariffs, right? We're going to take into consideration, tariffs is going to provide us the foundational work. It's going to provide us the data and insights to be able to sort of see where you compare versus the competition. But then we're also going to look at, the risks of pursuing an alternate mitigation strategy. We're going to look at the cost of moving that strategy. So the tariff analysis is sort of the very first thing, and that's, I'll say relatively straightforward in the fact that we're at least trying to make sure we understand where you are versus the marketplace. But then where our value then comes to the next step is how do we take it a little bit further. And so really try to understand that, develop the right strategy for your business, as opposed to we're not a boilerplate consultancy where we just show up with our playbook and say, do step A, step B, step C. We're really going to understand your business and understand the strategic objectives and imperatives, and then really work with you to design a strategy and an approach.
Okay, I just got a question.
Yeah.
What are some of the top strategic actions a business should take once they identify high tariff exposure? Well, I think that all depends on what the products are, what the exposure is, how that compares to their competitors.
Right.
Where are those alternative suppliers? Where we've helped some clients recently, they've gone out straight out. Obviously, we work with them, so one of the things that we have is good supplier prospecting partners that help us find good qualified suppliers, and they've been very quick on the boat to go and secure the supply, because what we're seeing is that there is also a little bit of a crunch on the domestic supply market, right? So with a lot of companies doing this now, because they're worried, and some of them are much proactive, we are seeing a crunch on the domestic supply market basis, and also some increases in domestic transport as well, as you would expect. Paul, what else would you see?
Yeah, no, I think that's the key thing, Waldo, right? Is the fact that it really is dependent upon your particular industry and your particular challenges, right? So that we can really make sure we understand the situation you're facing. A good question just came in. I like really with the uncertainty around which countries, which commodities, and how much, and that whipsaw. Canada, Mexico announced, delayed, then slapped, and then steel and aluminum, makes diversification a bit of a crapshoot. Any suggestions for dealing with all of this uncertainty? Well, that's part of what we're talking about here, right? Which is really, you need to understand your current position, right, and where your risks and exposure are, in your business, and how that compares. So, if for example, you've got major exposure in Mexico, let's say for an example, right? Then we want to understand before something happens with Mexico, what options do you have? So I like to call it almost like scenario planning or game theory or something like that, where we can understand your situation and sort of map out 4, 5, 6 possible scenarios, right? And what would the potential responses be, or the potential actions be? So then, if you think about what happens, I'm going to just use the military as an example, right? They've got decades, right, of battle plans, right, that may never, ever, ever come up. But the idea is they're thinking ahead of time. How am I going to respond or react if X, Y, and Z were to take place? And I think that's what we're talking about in this situation, is that you need to first understand where you stand, where your competition stands, how you fit into that global marketplace and what the exposure is, and then where are the things that can hurt you the most, right? If you're over indexed in Mexico, then tariffs in Mexico hurt you. So take it from there. Should U.S. organizations with primarily domestic supply chains still consider international sourcing initiatives as domestic demand and competition for domestic production rises? Absolutely. I think we firmly believe that we're in a global economy, and there's the right strategy for international sourcing, domestic sourcing, onshoring, nearshoring. A lot of it comes down to, again, your specific business. We like to think about, start with the customer, right? So understand what your customer requires from a market responsiveness, from a lead time, from a product, strategic product, new product development perspective, et cetera, and develop what's the appropriate strategy for how do you provide the best value to your end customer and to your shareholders. And so I think, even in an environment where China has tariffs, there are certainly a lot of products where China is going to continue to be a low cost producer for that product. You got to also understand, if tariffs go up in China, then there's the risk or likelihood that there will be some softening of demand coming out of China. So that means you may be able to get some pricing concessions. Container rates may come down, so you may be able to get some container pricing concessions. So it really needs to be a total cost decision and look into consideration the rest of your supply chain.
Yeah. Another one that came in is, how can you leverage the tariffs to use this as an opportunity? How can you leverage tariffs to use this as an opportunity to pass these along to your customers? Well, it's like any negotiation, right? And it's not necessarily that straightforward either. A lot of companies right now, just because of the whipsaw effect and who knows what's going to happen, they're just raising prices now so they can kind of get ahead of it, right? So, like Paul says, let's look at the entire effect across the market, right? So maybe you can show that tariff exposure is high for you in China, but then maybe over the next 3 or 4 months, that container rates are going to go down, and maybe you've got a really savvy customer that's able to prove that, right? So it's like any negotiation. But again, the market right now seems to be gradually increasing pricing already to get ahead of it. Right. The other thing you can do as well, if you've got a big import dependence on a country of concern, is you can also buy up stock inventory, ahead of time as well to mitigate that.
This next question is a really good one here too. Several importers say if new China tariffs are, let's say, 10%, they'll just take it and try to weather the storm rather than incur the additional sourcing and supply chain costs and risk of establishing newer supply bases. Given the uncertainty, especially threats against other countries, might the best strategy be to just stand pat? And the answer is maybe, right? And I think that's the key thing is, again, we have to start from a foundation. You have to think about it from a foundational perspective of where do things stand. And that's where we say, well, 10% may be okay, but what if it's 15? What if it's 20? And so you at least want to start from a position of having that game plan in place. So you can say, all right, I'm going to say 10%. 10% is okay for 3 months, right? But then what's going to be the plan after that? And then how do we go take it a little bit further in terms of being able to execute a plan 4 months down the road, so you can do that. So I think the key thing here, again, we're not saying that there's that one size fits all solution. It is understand your current situation in the marketplace, develop a roadmap and some scenarios of how to respond to different scenarios, and then be ready to pull the trigger or start laying some foundational work where you're not actually spending money on tooling or things like that, but you're at least doing planning and getting things prepared so that if you do need to pull the trigger. So it's risk and resilience here that we're trying to do, only we're applying it directly to the tariff situation.
Yeah. Just one thing I think worth mentioning, we didn't really cover it as well, but you can also reevaluate your tariff classification
Yeah, absolutely.
approach, right? So, again, some of these tariffs kick in a certain amount of value add. So there are certain things that you can do with sub-assemblies so that, when it comes to importing these goods, you may or may not be paying such high tariffs as well, right? So I see another interesting question. Well, I'll throw this one to you to start. Taking a contrarian view, China has a lot of growth potential this century. Could this approach identify opportunities to move production from the US to China?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our supply example here sort of showed that, right? Where, they took advantage of a down economy in China post-COVID and moved more business over to China, and it was very profitable for them, quite honestly. So I think yes, the answer is unequivocally yes. The key thing here is to think about when and why are tariffs utilized, right? So I'll say traditionally, tariffs have been utilized, right, when you're trying to develop or ensure that your domestic market is strong and capable. So, for example, one of the things that has come up a lot during the COVID thing was generic medication that went through, right? A lot of generic production had been outsourced to China and India, so that when we needed that production, or chips, as an example. We've all heard about the chips, and I think that's another example of it. It's very critical from a strategic perspective that we have the capabilities within any country, any sovereign country has the ability to create their own technology and their own chips and things like that. So if that is a product potentially that you need to buy, then that might be a strategy where you need to think about doing that domestically, because it is at a higher risk of a tariffs at some point in the future. Whereas if it's something that is, again, low value added, very high labor content, then those things, may not be as critical and as much at risk for tariffs or escalating tariff wars and things like that. So again, it's thinking through your business from a strategy perspective.
Yeah, just to add to that, right? So we as a company do a lot of work for within the Middle East, and part of our work there is identifying some of the most complex value chains and developing local content, right? Whether it's desalination, whether it's various products, but that is a big part of what a lot of governments and municipalities are trying to do. Let me look at what we're trying to do with cobalt here in the US, and lithium and other rare earth metals, right? So again, trying to not be reliant on those extended, potentially problematic supply chains. All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Some great questions.
All right, I think everyone's going to get a copy of the recording. We encourage you to reach out to Waldo or I directly, or reach out through our business development team. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And it doesn't take anything to have a quick 30-minute phone call and understand your challenges and your situation. And we're happy to provide some insights and advice of what steps you might want to take and how we might be able to proceed forward together. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you very much.